In the autumn of 1881, in a workshop on the eastern bank of the Naugatuck River, a coppersmith named Elias Hartwell was given an instruction he wrote down because he did not understand it. He was to keep making the copper crowns that topped the weather vanes shipped out of the valley by the thousand. He was to shape them exactly as he always had. But he was no longer to drill the seating channel that ran down through the spindle, and he was no longer to fit the braided cable that, for as long as anyone in the trade could remember, had been threaded through that channel and carried down inside the body of the roof. The cable, his foreman said, was an old habit. It added cost. The buyers in the cities did not want it. The vane was to point at the wind, and nothing more. Hartwell had been setting copper on rooftops for 31 years. His father had set it before him, in the same valley, for a firm that no longer exists under the name it carried then. In a ledger he kept at home, in an entry dated the 9th of October, 1881, he wrote one line beneath the day's accounts. He wrote that they had told him to stop grounding the crowns, and that he did not believe the men who gave the order knew what the grounding had been for. If this record has your attention, hit the like button and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It matters to know who is paying attention to this. That ledger survives. It sits today in a county historical collection in western Connecticut, uncatalogued in any way that would lead a researcher to it, filed under the name of the house it came from rather than the man who wrote it. Most of it is unremarkable. It records the price of sheet copper, the wages of 2 apprentices, the cost of a new pair of seaming pliers. But across the final years of entries, between ordinary sums, Hartwell left a record of the season in which his trade was changed by an order he was never given a reason for. He was watching something end, and he did not have the words for what it was. He had only the certainty, set down in a steady hand, that the men above him were removing something they did not understand, and that the removal was deliberate. To follow what he believed he was losing, you have to set aside almost everything you were taught about the object on the roof. The weather vane in the modern imagination is a piece of folk decoration, a rooster, an arrow, a horse, a ship, mounted on a spindle, turning to show the direction of the wind. Charming, rural, obsolete. The kind of thing sold now in garden centers as a reproduction of a simpler age. That is the entire meaning the object has been permitted to keep. But the weather vane that Hartwell made was not principally an arrow, and it was not principally about wind. It was a copper terminal at the highest point of a structure, machined to a specific profile, joined to a conductor that ran the full height of the building and terminated somewhere below. The figure that turned in the wind sat above all of that, and the figure is the only part the modern account remembers. The rest, the part that mattered to the men who built it, has been folded away into a footnote about lightning. That footnote has a name attached to it, and the name is real. In the summer of 1752, in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin demonstrated that the charge in a storm cloud and the spark from a laboratory jar were the same thing. Out of that demonstration came the lightning rod, the pointed metal terminal raised above a roof and connected by a conductor to the ground, so that a strike would pass through the metal and into the earth instead of through the timber and the people inside. This is taught as settled history, and in its outline it is true. Franklin built the rods. They worked. Buildings that carried them survived storms that burned their neighbors. The combining of the two functions was not an accident of thrift, and the older builders did not treat the pointed terminal the way a modern electrician treats a ground spike. They treated the highest copper point on a structure as the most important fitting on the building, the one that justified the cost of pure metal and skilled hands when cheaper work would have served for anything merely ornamental. A man did not pay a coppersmith to climb to the ridge of his house and set near pure copper in a machined profile because he wanted a weathercock. He could have had a weathercock cut from sheet iron for a fraction of the price. He paid for the copper and the conductor and the careful joining because the fitting did work that the iron rooster could not do, and the price he was willing to pay is itself a record of how much that work was valued before anyone thought to call it decoration. What the settled account does not dwell on is how quickly and how widely the pointed terminal and the turning figure became the same object. Within a generation of Franklin's work, across the eastern seaboard and across large parts of Europe, the highest copper point on a building was very often both the wind vane and the conductor's terminal. The two functions were combined in the same fitting. The figure turned, the metal beneath it carried, and the cable that Hartwell was told to stop installing was that conductor, the part that connected the copper at the top to whatever lay at the bottom. Here the official story and the older record begin to separate, and the separation is the whole matter. In the version taught in every schoolroom, the conductor runs down the outside of the building and ends in the earth. A copper rod driven into wet ground. A plate buried beneath the cellar floor. The purpose is discharge. The charge comes down from the sky and is carried away into the soil, where it disperses and is gone. Everything about the design, in this account, points outward and downward and away. The building is protected by being emptied. The energy is treated as a threat, and the entire apparatus exists to remove it. The older installations do not always match that description, and the places where they fail to match it are the places the record has been most thoroughly cleaned. Hartwell's ledger is one of those places. In an entry from the spring of 1879, 2 years before the order to stop, he records a repair on a public building in a town he names only by its initial, a building he had first fitted as a young man under his father. He notes that the conductor did not run to a ground rod. It ran, in his words, to the iron in the foundation and to the copper sheet beneath the lowest floor, and it was joined there to the other lines that came down from the corners and the ridge. He does not write that this was unusual. He writes it the way a man writes something ordinary, the way he records the price of solder. The conductor came down and joined a network inside the structure. It did not leave the building, it fed it. This is the detail that does not survive translation into the modern account, because the modern account has no place to put it. A lightning rod that does not terminate in the ground is not a lightning rod. It is the reverse of one. A conductor that gathers the charge from the highest point of a building and carries it inward, to plates and to iron and to a network joined at the base, is not shielding the building from the sky. It is binding the building to it. What such a network was for is the question that the men who gave Hartwell his order did not want asked, and it is the question the record was altered to prevent. The answer the old world believed, as far as the surviving fragments allow it to be reconstructed, was that the charge in the air above a structure was not only a danger to be discharged, it was, in certain conditions and in certain quantities, a thing that could be collected. The copper crown was the collector, the conductor was the channel, and the network at the base was where the collected charge was meant to go, into whatever system the builders had designed to hold it or to use it. What that system was, in any single building, is the part of the record that was most carefully removed, and the manner of its removal is part of the evidence. The household and estate manuals of the 17th and 18th centuries, the same kind of detailed domestic books that once explained the covering of mirrors and the management of a great house, contained sections on the care of the roof metal, and those sections are precisely the ones missing from the editions reprinted after the middle of the 19th century. Earlier printings describe the conductor and its joining and the keeping of the green in plain practical language, as a matter every steward of a large house was expected to know. Later printings of the same works, issued by the same houses under the same titles, drop those passages without comment, as though they had never been there. The libraries that held the older editions withdrew them across the same period, recorded as outdated, replaced on the shelf by the cleaned reprints. A reader today who consults what appears to be the standard text finds nothing about the roof metal at all, and has no reason to suspect that anything was taken out. The removal was done at the level of the source, in the work of reprinting and reshelving, so that the gap would not look like a gap. It would look like there had never been anything to say. The strongest evidence for this is not a document. It is the metal itself and the consistency of the metal across distances that should have produced variation and did not. The copper crowns of the old installations, the ones made before the trade was changed, were not the cheap rolled alloy that replaced them. They were near pure copper, soft, heavy, worked by hand to a profile that recurs with very little variation across enormous geographic spread. The same swelling at the base of the spindle, the same hollow sphere or pair of spheres set below the figure, the same machined seating where the conductor entered. A craftsman in the Naugatuck Valley, and a craftsman in Saxony, and a craftsman in the north of England, men who never met and never corresponded, produced the same fitting to the same tolerances, as if they were all working from an instruction that none of them had written and none of them questioned. The modern explanation for this is convention. Trades copy one another, patterns spread. Fashions in ironwork and copperwork travel along trade routes and settle into habit. This is true of decoration. It is not true of function. Decoration drifts. A rooster in one country becomes a horse in another. A ship on the coast becomes a stag in the hills. The figure on top did drift, exactly as decoration drifts. But the part beneath the figure, the part that carried, did not drift. The collector and the seating and the conductor stayed the same across the entire range, while the ornament above them changed freely. That is the signature of a functional standard, not a decorative one. The part that did a job was held constant. The part that was only for looking at was allowed to vary. The same uniformity sits on the churches, and the churches are where the old method is hardest to wave away. Across Europe, the highest point of nearly every great church and cathedral carried a copper finial, a cross or a cockerel or a spire cap, and beneath that copper ran metal, down through the full height of the tower into the stone and the crypt below. The cockerel on a church spire is explained today as a symbol, a weathercock with a story from Scripture attached to it, and the story is old and real. But the bird sat on a copper standard joined to a conductor that ran the height of the tallest structure in the town, into the deepest stone foundation for miles, and the men who maintained those towers across the centuries kept that metal sound and kept it joined with a care that no mere symbol would have earned. The tallest building in a settlement, crowned in copper, conductor run to the deepest ground, repeated in town after town across a continent. The official account asks you to read that as coincidence of style and faith. The older account read it as what it plainly was: the largest collector in the district, raised on the highest structure available, maintained by the one institution with the reach to maintain it everywhere at once. The cathedral records bear this out in the one place they can still be read, which is the accounts of maintenance. Across the centuries, the chapters and the parishes that ran these buildings paid, year upon year, for the upkeep of the metal at the summit of the tower, for the conductor to be inspected and rejoined where weather had worked it loose, for the copper to be kept sound. The expense recurs in the books of building after building with a regularity that no symbol would have commanded. A cross of gilt or stone, set once and left, costs nothing to keep. The metal on these towers cost money every year, and the money was paid, generation after generation, by institutions that did not throw it away on things that did nothing. Whatever the conductor on a cathedral spire was understood to do, it was understood to be worth maintaining at continuous expense for as long as the building stood. The moment that understanding lapsed is the same moment in the same decades that the maintenance stops appearing in the books, and the metal is left to corrode untended for the first time in the building's history. The hollow spheres beneath the figure are the part of the design that the reproduction industry kept without any idea of what it had kept. Look at almost any old weather vane and you will find them. 1 or 2, or sometimes 3, copper balls threaded onto the spindle below the pointer. The garden center catalogue calls them decorative. The older trade did not. In the few apprentice notes that survive from the copper houses of the period, the spheres are described as part of the gathering, hollow, because they were meant to be hollow, sized in a sequence that the notes give, as a rule, to be followed, rather than a style to be chosen. What a hollow sphere of pure copper at the top of a charged conductor was understood to do is not stated plainly in any source that survives. The sources that would have stated it plainly are precisely the sources that were withdrawn. But the spheres were not ornament to the men who made them. They were specified. And a thing that is specified to a rule is a thing that was believed to do something. There is also the matter of the patina, and here the old accounts and the modern ones diverge in a way that can still be tested, though almost no one tests it. Copper exposed to the weather forms a green skin, the verdigris that coats every old roof and statue. The modern account treats this as simple corrosion, the slow oxidation of the surface, cosmetic and inert. The older accounts treat the green skin of a working crown as something else. They describe it as carrying, as holding a faint charge that the bare metal beneath did not, as the part of the fitting that did the actual gathering once the metal had aged into it. A new crown, in this account, did little. A crown that had stood for 40 years and grown its full green skin was the one that worked. This is why the old installations were never cleaned. The green was not neglect. The green was the working surface, and to polish it back to bright copper was to undo the years of weathering that had made the collector function at all. A polished crown was a dead crown, and the old trade knew it, which is why the instruction to keep the green appears in every set of apprentice notes that survives, and why the men who tended the great buildings would no more have scoured a working crown to brightness than a miller would have let his stones run dry. The reproduction trade, knowing none of this, sold its bright new copper on the strength of how it shone, and the shine was the proof that it would never gather anything. If the copper crowns were collectors, then the order Hartwell received in 1881 was not a small change in manufacturing practice. It was the disabling of a system, and the record shows that the same disabling happened almost everywhere at almost the same time. The auction and estate records of the 1870s and 1880s show a pattern that has never been explained because it has never been assembled. Across this narrow window, in city after city, the conductors were cut. Not removed in most cases. Cut. The copper crown was left in place, turning in the wind, while the cable that joined it to the building below was severed at the eaves and the lower length pulled out and sold for scrap. The cut is always at the same place, low on the building where a man could reach it from a ladder, and always done the same way, the upper run left hanging and the lower run taken. It is not the pattern of buildings being re-roofed at different times by different hands for different reasons. It is the pattern of a single instruction carried out everywhere, the cheapest possible way to disable a system without the expense of dismantling it, leaving the visible ornament in place so that no one in the street would ever ask what had been taken down. If this investigation is still with you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there is more buried here than any single film can contain. Your attention is what makes it possible to keep pulling this forward. The figure remained. The function was gone. To anyone looking up from the street, nothing had changed. The vane still pointed at the wind. But the thing it had been joined to, the network inside the structure, was now connected to nothing, and the copper at the top was now gathering into a wire that ended in air. The same window shows the replacement of the near-pure copper crowns with the cheaper alloy reproductions, sold as modern improvements, lighter and less costly, and, the catalogue said, every bit as handsome. They were handsome. They were also inert. The wrong metal worked to the wrong profile, with the spheres kept only as decoration, and the seating channel often not drilled at all. Exactly the change Hartwell was ordered to make. Within a single generation, the working crowns were coming down, and the ornamental ones were going up, and the knowledge of the difference was passing out of the trade with the old men who were not training anyone to replace them. The question that the cut cables raise is the question of who benefited, and the answer is not hidden. It is sitting in plain sight at the exact center of the same decade. In September of 1882, 1 year after Hartwell wrote his line about the crowns, Thomas Edison switched on the Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan. It was the first central electrical generating station to serve a district of paying customers, and the model it established is the model the world still runs on. Power is made in one place, owned by one company, carried out along wires to the buildings that need it, and measured at the door of each building by a meter that counts what is used so that it can be billed. The meter is the center of the whole arrangement. Everything in the system exists so that the energy can be counted as it crosses from the company's wire into the customer's wall, because the counting is how the money is made. A rooftop that collected its own charge from the air had no place in that arrangement, and worse than no place, it was a direct contradiction of the principle the arrangement depended on. A building that gathered even a fraction of what it needed from a copper crown and a network in its own foundation was a building that drew that fraction from no wire, paid for it to no company, and recorded it on no meter. It was, in the precise terms of the new industry, uncountable, and an uncountable source of power, distributed across every rooftop that carried an old crown, available to anyone who maintained the cable and let the green grow, was not a competitor the new utilities could buy out or undersell. It was a thing that had to cease to exist and cease to be remembered before the model could be made universal. The decade that cut the cables is the decade that built the alternative. Edison's company and its competitors and the financial houses behind them, the same Morgan capital that backed Pearl Street and would later fold Edison's interests into the firm that became General Electric in 1892, spent these years laying the physical and legal foundation of centralized power. Generating stations, distribution networks, franchises granted by cities, rates set and approved, the meter on every wall, and running alongside all of it, the slow public redefinition of the older method as no method at all, as decoration, as the quaint copper rooster of a vanished countryside that had never done anything but turn in the wind. The great fairs were where the redefinition was made into spectacle. At the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, the White City was lit by electric light on a scale no public had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of bulbs fed by a central plant. The whole gleaming district a single argument made in light. That power came from the company and the wire and the meter, and from nowhere else. The buildings of that fair bristled with finials and crowns and copper points, every roofline crowded with them, because the architectural language of the old world was the only language the builders knew. But not one of those crowns was connected to anything. They were ornament now, raised by the thousand above a district whose power ran entirely through wires. The form of the old system preserved exactly at the moment its function was being declared never to have existed. The fairgoers walked beneath a skyline of collectors that collected nothing, lit by a system that had replaced them, and were told that this was the dawn of the age of power, the very beginning, as though nothing had ever stood on those roofs before. There is one man whose work cuts straight across this story, because he tried to build, at a single enormous scale, the thing the old crowns had done, at small scale, on every roof. And the record of what happened to him is not hidden at all. On Long Island, beginning in 1901, Nikola Tesla raised a tower at a place called Wardenclyffe. It stood more than 50 meters high and ended in a great copper terminal at the top. And beneath it, Tesla sank ironwork and tubing deep into the ground, because he said the system would not work as an aerial alone, that it had to be joined to the earth as much as to the sky. His stated aim was the transmission of power without wires, drawn in part from the charge of the atmosphere and the ground themselves, made available, in his words, to any point on the globe. He was describing, in the language of his own century, a collector and a conductor and a network in the ground. The same three things that sat on Hartwell's roofs, raised to the scale of a continent. The tower was funded at the start by the same Morgan capital that stood behind the central stations and the firm that became General Electric. And when it became clear what Tesla actually intended, a system whose power could not be metered because it was simply present in the air for anyone to draw, the funding was withdrawn. The work stopped. The tower stood unused for years and was pulled down for scrap during the war in 1917. The man who had tried to make atmospheric power universal died with his notebooks and his name attached to a reputation for impractical dreams, and the lesson that the same financial interest drew from his tower was the lesson it had already drawn from 10,000 rooftops. Power that cannot be counted, cannot be sold, and a source that cannot be sold, cannot be allowed to stand. The detail that matters most in the Wardenclyffe story is the ground, because it is the detail that connects the tower to the rooftops. Tesla was insistent that the system was not an aerial reaching up into the sky alone, but a circuit joined at both ends, the copper terminal above and the deep ironwork below, the same inward joining to the foundation that Hartwell had recorded on the public building in 1879. He had arrived, by his own physics and at vast scale, at the identical arrangement the old crowns embodied on every roof, and the same capital that had spent a decade severing that arrangement from 10,000 buildings was never going to fund its resurrection on Long Island once it understood what it was looking at. No order to do any of this survives with a name on it, and the absence of such an order is itself consistent with how the thing was done. There was no single instruction, no signed directive, no room in which a decision was taken to erase the copper crowns from human memory. There did not need to be. The cables were cut firm by firm, building by building, each cut justified on its own small ground of cost and fashion and progress. The reproductions were sold one at a time. The trade knowledge lapsed one retirement at a time, as men like Hartwell grew old and were not asked to pass on the part of the craft that no longer had a buyer. The school books updated themselves, edition by edition, until the lightning rod was a story about Franklin and discharge and nothing else, and the weather vane was a story about the wind. By the time the last coppersmith who had drilled a seating channel by hand was in the ground, there was no one left who could say with authority that the object had ever done anything at all. The knowledge did not have to be destroyed. It only had to be allowed to die, and the men who would have carried it forward were the men whose trade had been made pointless. That is what Hartwell understood, in his way, in the autumn of 1881. He could not have named Pearl Street. He almost certainly never heard of the financial arrangements that would become General Electric, and he died before Tesla raised his tower. But he had set copper on roofs for 31 years, and he knew the difference between a fitting that did something and a fitting that only looked as though it did, and he had just been ordered to make the second kind and call it the first. He wrote his line in the ledger, and then, by the account that survives, he did one more thing. Elias Hartwell lived another 14 years. He died in the winter of 1895, in the house where he had kept the ledger, in his 74th year. He had outlived the trade by more than a decade, and had spent those years, by the recollection of his family, increasingly unwilling to speak about the work that had once defined him. He had seen the reproductions go up. He had seen the green crowns come down and the bright inert ones replace them. He had watched, from the ground, the system he had served his whole life be unbuilt above his head and renamed beneath his feet, and he had said almost nothing about it to anyone. The exception, and the reason any of this can be told at all, was his granddaughter. Her account of his final winter exists in a memoir she set down many years later, privately printed in a small run for her own family, and never published beyond it, of which a handful of copies survive in private hands. She was a young woman when he died, and she had sat with him through the last weeks, and she wrote that in those weeks he talked, for the first time she could remember, about the crowns. She wrote that he told her the cable had never been about lightning, or not only about it, that the lightning was the reason you could give a city man without being thought a fool. She wrote that he described the old buildings he had fitted as a boy, the public halls and the churches and the larger houses, and the way the conductors in those buildings had run inward to the iron and the copper plate and joined the network at the base. She wrote that he said the buildings had been warmer than they should have been in the cold before the cables were cut, and that the men who tended them had known to keep the green and never to scrape the crowns, and that there had been a faint life to those structures, a quality he struggled to name to her and finally called only a steadiness. that had gone out of them in the years after the conductors were severed. He told her the buildings had felt different afterward, emptier than the cutting of one copper wire should have made them, as though something that had been present in them, gathered and held and used without anyone outside the trade ever being told, had been let out and not let back. She was careful in the memoir, and the care is part of what makes the account credible rather than less so. She did not claim to understand what her grandfather meant. She wrote down what he said, and she wrote that she did not know whether it was the truth of the trade or the wandering of an old man at the end of a long life, and she left the judgment to whoever read it. She recorded that he was clear in his mind to the last, that he did not ramble in other matters, that he knew her and knew the date and spoke of the crowns with the same steadiness he had brought to everything else. She wrote, too, that he spoke of the cutting with no anger, which surprised her, and that when she asked him why the men had done it, if the crowns had been worth keeping, he told her that they had not done it out of malice, and most of them had not understood it any better than the buyers in the cities did. The order had come down to them as it had come down to him, as a matter of cost and fashion, and they had passed it on, without knowing they were the hands that closed a door 400 years old. The ones who understood, he said, were not the ones doing the cutting. The ones who understood had never needed to touch a roof. And she recorded one thing more, the thing that the official account of the weather vane has no answer for and never addresses, because the official account does not admit the question exists. She wrote that in his last days her grandfather asked her to go up into the roof of their own house, where as a younger man he had fitted a crown and run a conductor in the old way, before the order, for his own home, where no foreman could stop him. He asked her to find whether the cable was still whole. She went up. She wrote that she found the conductor still there, still joined at the top to the green copper of the crown above, and still running down into the dark of the structure, toward the foundation, never cut, the one installation he had been able to protect. She told him it was whole, and she wrote that he closed his eyes and said that then it did not matter what they did to the rest, that one of them was still gathering, still joined to the sky the way the old ones had been, and that as long as a single one of them was left whole somewhere, the knowledge of what they were for was not entirely gone. What remains is more than you would expect, because the disabling was done by cutting rather than removing, and a cut leaves an end. In the roof spaces of old buildings across the country and across Europe, the severed conductors are still there. A length of braided copper or iron running down from the ridge or the corner, green with age, ending abruptly a few feet down where a saw or a pair of shears went through it more than a century ago. The lower length long since pulled and sold, the upper length left because no one paid to take it out. Builders who renovate old structures find these stubs and do not know what they are. They are recorded, when they are recorded at all, as redundant lightning protection, disused, of no interest. They are the cut ends of the network, and they are common enough that anyone who works on old roofs has seen them without being told what they once joined. There is no register of them, no survey, no count. They are too ordinary to have been thought worth recording, and too numerous to record now. Every old town has them, in the towers and the halls and the older houses, cut ends green with a century and a half of weather, joined at the top to copper that still turns in the wind, and at the bottom to nothing at all. The seating channels are still there too, drilled down through the spindles of the genuine old crowns, the machined opening where the conductor entered, on every working crown made before the trade was changed. The reproductions do not have them. You can tell the two apart by looking, if you know to look, the way Hartwell could tell them apart. The old ones drilled to receive a cable that is no longer fitted, the new ones cast solid because there was never going to be a cable to receive. The copper rooster on the barn that the tourists photograph is, very often, a working collector with its conductor cut and its channel empty, gathering charge from the air into a wire that ends a yard below it in the dark, exactly as it has done since the 1880s, joined to nothing, doing the one thing it was built to do, with no longer anywhere to send it. The Naugatuck Valley foundries are mostly gone. the brass and copper houses that made the valley one of the great metalworking districts of the country, closed across the 20th century. The buildings demolished or repurposed into other things, the trade and its knowledge scattered. The firm Hartwell's father worked for does not exist under any name. The workshop on the eastern bank of the river, where the order came down in 1881, is not standing. What is standing, here and there across the country, are the crowns those workshops shipped, turning on roofs above towns whose people have been told for nearly a century and a half that the thing on the roof is an arrow that points at the wind. The ledger is in the county collection, filed under the wrong name, its final entries unread by anyone looking for what they contain. The memoir is in private hands, printed for a family that has mostly forgotten it, and on a house in western Connecticut, if it still stands, there may be a single copper crown, grown full green with 140 winters, joined still by an uncut conductor to the iron in a foundation, the one installation an old coppersmith was able to keep whole, gathering whatever it gathers out of the air above a quiet street, the last of its kind left joined to the sky. He died believing that as long as it remained, the knowledge of what the crowns were for had not entirely left the world. He may have been right. The evidence survived, in the cut ends and the empty channels, and the steady hand of a man who wrote down what he was not permitted to understand, because it was hidden in plain sight on 10,000 roofs, too ordinary to be worth destroying, too common to be worth the trouble of explaining away. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the record. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.